just take some notes as we're going along. And we're going to do this a little differently because our person who is going to introduce our in-person speaker is actually on our call, calling in. And it is Colin Boisvert. And who's Colin's dad? So Paul, you unmute please and introduce Colin.
Yes, hi, can you hear me in the room?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, wonderful. This will be much more effective if I don't have to pantomime. So thanks for being able to introduce Colin, who is my son. I see he didn't take my suggestion for the talk, the name of the talk, which was, my thesis is pain in the neck. Colin, I'm going to let that one go. Colin, as you may or may not know, is a second-year master's student at BYU, studying sauropods under Brooks Britt, who chairs the geology department. Colin came to BYU after doing a double major in geology and biology at the University of California at Davis. Colin's about 24 years old, a little bit older, coming up on 25, but I can say that he's been a dinosaur expert for at least 21 of those years, just with varying levels of academic accreditation. So I look forward to his talk. And as a reminder, please hold questions to the end and throw them in the chat. Colin, take it away.
All right. So just real quick, this is my stamp from BYU I had to make for an assignment. You're probably wondering, what does the random Latin say? Nos qui sumus etiam si aliquando oblivici. That was probably very much butchered, but we are who we are, even if we sometimes forget. So moving forward. Oh, joy. Too far. Okay. There we are. What are interesting?
Maybe because of
I don't know if that's the case, then all right.
yeah. Should get a digital native to do this stuff.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
That's fair.
Sorry, he doesn't have his notes, so.
All right, let's do this.
We know why.
All right, what are sauropods? Well, to be very plain, these are sauropods. One of the images courtesy of the Natural History Museum of Utah. Thank you very much. Sauropods, and specifically Sauropodomorpha, is a clade of animals that includes what we traditionally call the prosauropods and sauropods. They were around from the late Triassic to the late Cretaceous, and they were there at the end of the Cretaceous when the asteroid hit the Earth 66 million years ago. We see Sauropodomorpha range in size from about 1.5 meters to about 40 meters in length. Most sauropods, though, are truly massive animals with 12 to 19 cervical vertebrae or 12 to 19 neck bones. For comparison, humans and almost all groups of mammals have 7. The animal I'm talking about today has 15, twice as many neck bones. So very interesting. So first, we got to go back. We got Jurassic North America, right? This is when the Morrison Formation, the rocks are being laid down, and it looks a little bit different. I mean, today, Salt Lake City is nestled at the foot of the Wasatch Range. But 150 million years ago, these snow-capped mountains didn't exist. Instead, the land is considered to be a vast savanna. The climate was warm. However, paleontologists go back and forth as to whether it was seasonally arid or consistently wet. Hashtag wet Morrison versus hashtag dry Morrison, as they. Now, Apatosaurus, and specifically Apatosaurus excelsus, is a large sauropod about the size of a semi-truck. We're talking an animal that's roughly around 75 feet long, 18 to 24 tons. This is a big animal, 15 neck bones, like I said, and we see this guy in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, even parts of Oklahoma, where they actually have a very supposed massive Apatosaurus. So Apatosaurus is all over the place. And today, though, specifically, I will be talking about Apatosaurus excelsus if we're lumping versus traditionally, or sorry, more recently, Shop et al. Says that my specimen I'll be talking about is Brontosaurus parvus. So what is it? It's an apatosaurian. That's what I'm going to say. It's an apatosaurian. That's what we're going with. So As we go into sauropod neck research, I have decided for my own personal benefit, I roughly broke it up into about 4 stages. The first stage is the 20th century, turn of the 21st century. Second stage is the 2000s. Third stage is the 2010s. And the fourth stage being laid down right now is the 2020s. What will happen with sauropod neck research this decade? It's a very interesting question. But I hope, and in this case I will be, part of the story. So first off, the 20th century, turn of the 21st century. Well, there was some very early work with some great drawings by Gilmore in 1936 of Apatosaurus, where he talked a little bit about these cervical vertebrae. But the first, I'd say, big paper, foundational paper for my research was the 1999 paper by Stevens and Parrish, which used CM3018 and CM84 specimens from the Carnegie Museum, basically looking at, all right, can we build a digital model and figure out how these animals are moving their neck? What they defined and developed in their paper was this idea of ONP, osteological neutral pose or osteological neutral position. The idea that if you put the animal's neck where all the ligaments are relaxed and the stresses on the zygapophyses, which are those pre and post connecting parts of the bones other than the centrum or ball, you try to minimize those stresses. How exactly is this animal holding its neck? In this case, they came to the conclusion these two diplodocids were holding their neck straight out with their head and neck below the shoulders. So these were low browsing animals. These weren't the classic S-shaped sauropods feeding high in the trees. Of course, this idea gets challenged. And so we see camps form. But for the time, we have our low browsing sauropods. And this idea was popularized in the 1999 documentary, Walking with Dinosaurs. Now, as we move forward into the 2000s, we see a couple of papers right off the bat that start using this idea of extant phylogenetic bracketing. Basically, can we use living outgroups and the structures we see in them to try to determine what structures, such as soft tissue, ligaments, as well as in this case, the orientation of the pectoral girdle, aka those bones right around the shoulders and near the ribs, to figure out how exactly does this animal look and how can we reconstruct it. 2 papers by Schwartz et al. Looked at first reconstructing the scapulocoracoid and the pectoral girdle of these animals. What they found is they had bony-like plates with some cartilaginous attachment. And in this case, looking at 3 different sauropods, Epistocelicadia, Camarasaurus, and Diplodocus, these animals, it looks like, had a steeply oriented coracoid relative to a horizontal plane. So what that means is sauropod coracoids, their shoulder blades, are like this generally. They were at least greater than 45 degrees, with ranges between 55 to 70 at the max for the different species. And if you have questions on what's specific for which ones, I'd be happy to do that with questions. Just at the moment, don't have it off the top of my head. I apologize. Now, the other paper from 2007 by Schwartz et al. Used EPB, extant phylogenetic bracketing, to determine, all right, what types of soft tissue can we reconstruct for these animals? What we see here in this image is a croc model versus a bird model for musculature and ligaments with these 2 animals. So Camarasaurus has the croc model where its neck muscles and ligaments are mostly near the base of the neck. Versus with the bird model in Diplodocus, these muscles are mostly near the dorsal portion of the neck. And so using these 2 ideas, what they tried to do is that if they saw the structure in both crocs and in birds, then they said, all right, this structure likely by this method is in sauropods. For one-way reconstructions, aka we see it in one group, but not in the other extant group, then it gets a little bit more ambiguous. And if you don't see it in either, then we know that sauropods don't have it. But at the same time, sauropods likely had anomalous structures that were different from their living outgroups. Now, as we move forward, Dezemski and Christian looked at, once again, soft tissue and ligament reconstruction, but they also challenged the idea a little bit of ONP, saying these animals were not likely holding their neck in osteological neutral position all the time. Instead, they likely held their neck in slightly different activity-based or habitual postures more often. And ONP was really just kind of the middle of the boat, per se. Now, what they found, right, is that these animals could move their necks a lot. And actually, it's possible that where traditionally it was always thought sauropod necks cannot go to where they're connecting pre- and post-zygapophyses have less than 50% overlap, they found, looking at mammals, it's possible sauropods may have gotten down as little as 1/3 if they were similar to mammals. But we're still trying to determine, all right, how far can these animals move their neck? Now, Taylor et al. In 2009 comes about and says, well, actually, it looks like the way sauropods hold their heads, in this case, down, flexing down, these animals may have actually been able to pull off the classic S-shaped pose like a bird. This is kind of the first big argument against the idea of sauropods holding their necks directly out and back to the traditional idea of these are high browsers in the tree. They also claim that sauropods likely held their necks in different positions for different activities or habits, and that O&P is really just the middle pose between all the way up and all the way down and all the way to the sides. As we move forward into the 2000s, we got a really cool paper where they took an ostrich neck and they peeled back layer by layer of tissue and muscle and ligaments all the way down to just the bones. They had even wet and dry cartilage to figure out, okay, can we discern any patterns in this ostrich neck? Because ostriches are an extant outgroup and they have a similarly long neck with elongated cervicals. Can we figure out how is this animal's range of mobility working? And what they found was that generally two big things were restricting this animal's range of motion. Osteological stops, or basically something in the bone saying, you can't get past me, and musculature. They also found the ostrich neck split into three sections, right? They had a cranial section, a middle section, and then a posterior section with different ranges of flexibility in different areas. But there was no clear pattern between the three sections. Now, also along with this paper, we also see a paper by Mallison where he looks at Plateosaurus, reconstructing some of its bones digitally and finding it seems an early evolution for the steeply oriented scapular coracoid. So it looks like in this group that steeply oriented pectoral girdle is maybe an ancestral feature versus a derived feature in the sauropods. Now, as we move forward, in 2013, we got papers by Stevens as well as Prushoff and Klein. Prushoff and Klein were looking at cervical ribs. How are cervical ribs acting in this model for sauropod research? And what they found was it looks like sauropod cervical ribs had longitudinal fibers and therefore acted like ossified tendons. So they provided some bracing for the animal, some ventral bracing. And what they also found was that different length cervical ribs restricted flexibility. Diplodocids, which had pretty short cervical ribs, were able to move their necks more than, say, brachiosaurs or even mamenchisaurs, who have ridiculously long cervical ribs and therefore maybe aren't as flexible. Now, Stevens looked at methodology, and what he was trying to do was using methodology and structure to figure out function, right? How are these animals moving their neck? How much can we really compare them to birds? Some of the big takeaways from his paper was these animals likely had stiffer necks than birds. Therefore, every time I see a swan at a pond, I curse it for its ability to be able to hold its neck and move it in all kinds of crazy directions. Sauropods likely weren't doing that. But similar to birds and different from mammals, sauropods likely had close intervertebral separations, aka they had thinner intervertebral discs, right? They're not having massive intervertebral cartilage discs between their neck bones. Now, eventually we get to Taylor and Wadle and then Taylor in 2014, and they took the idea of cartilage and tried to figure out, all right, what can we see? They did some CT scans of several Apatosaurus specimens as well as Sauroposeidon. And what they found in both Sauroposeidon and Apatosaurus was a unique condyle-cotyle morphology, different from other animals, making it difficult to say, okay, can we try to figure out a way to determine, estimate how much intervertebral cartilage this animal has? It turns out it's difficult. It's not as easy as we thought. But while these animals did have thinner cartilage discs, with estimates for Sauroposeidon as little as 4.5% cartilage compared to the length of the centrum, and about 10% for Apatosaurus, these animals, when you add the cartilage, it actually changes their osteological neutral position, and you now have cartilaginous neutral position, which adds about 13 degrees per bone, and therefore increases this animal's range of motion, indicating with that, all right, this animal maybe really could pull off the S shape versus straight out. So, which is it? High browser or feeding low to the ground? We have our two camps. And then, of course, you have everyone in the middle who either hasn't made a choice or says, maybe differs per group. Now, eventually we get a paper by Woodruff, Kerry Woodruff. He looks at bifurcated neural spines. This is a dorsal. This is dorsal 2 for my specimen. As you can see, its neural spine is split in two. Right? This is a bifurcated neural spine. Now, along with this bifurcated neural spine, we see a split nuchal ligament, which they think would have helped these sauropods, specifically with the elastic arm, as they basically swept their neck from side to side, lateral sweep feeding, therefore making these animals, such as Apatosaurus and Diplodocus, lateral sweep feeders that had their neck low to the ground, but they were going side to side, expending as little energy as possible, but feeding in a wide arc. Now, the idea from that is, well, we have sauropods, such as Apatosaurus, living with sauropods that don't have a bifurcated neural spine. So maybe you do have sauropods with bifurcated neural spines using lateral sweep feeding, and those without using a different method. It's an interesting idea. As well as Woodruff's paper also looked at the possibility of a new comparative analog. Camels have been used, horses have been used, giraffes have been used, birds have been used, crocs have been used. But what about a bovid by the name of the Ankole Watutsi? This animal has a mobile weight, aka its head off its body, and has bifurcated neural spines with a split nuchal ligament similar to Diplodocus. So maybe this animal could be a new comparative analog for sauropod researchers, especially those that have this bifurcated neural spine and are going from side to side. Along with Woodruff, Gregory S. Paul enters the picture, and he writes a paper saying we should ditch osteological neutral position and instead focus on maximal reach. Maximal reach is an idea that has a lot more functional benefit compared to this idea of, okay, how are they holding their neck? No, come on, they have different habitual poses, and these animals are likely moving their necks in different ways, so we should look at maximal reach instead. But he also claimed that with structures we see, such as retrovertebral pelvi, maybe sauropods were able to rear up, and maybe we do have different sauropods with different necks doing different things in the same environment, which we'll talk a little bit about later, why that likely is. Now, finally, we get into the 2020s. Vidal et al. In 2020 took Spinosaurus, an animal from Africa, an early eusauropod, and compared it to giraffes. He had 4 hypotheses he wanted to test. 1, does intervertebral space diminish with ontogenetic development? 2, does some of the life positions that we see in giraffes and potentially see in this animal require disarticulating vertebrae? 3, does range of motion increase with ontogenetic development? And then 4, can you use the bones to estimate or give a rough idea of how much intervertebral space there is? And what he found was, 1, you don't need to disarticulate your vertebrae to do some of these crazy poses. Doesn't require a break in the neck. This animal can do it. 2, intervertebral space for the cartilage does diminish with ontogenetic development. So you start out with wide areas for cartilage, and then it shrinks as these bones elongate with ontogenetic development. He also found, yes, osteologically alone can be a good rough estimate for intervertebral space. And in this case, as the animal grows up, its neck is able to hit more poses. It has a wider arc, its range of motion increases. So this was a pretty important paper. And this paper said, based on what they saw and other factors, that this animal, Spinosaurus, was a high browsing animal. Now, just because this animal is high browsing doesn't mean my animal is high browsing. Now we get to 2020 or 2022. Sorry, we passed 2020. We're done with that. 2022 was interesting because we see another paper by Taylor that looks at, all right, what are the main issues plaguing sauropod neck research? There are 2 main issues: completeness and distortion. Now, completeness, he described as it's not 100%. Sorry, with a 25-meter animal that weighs 30 tons, you are not going to get the whole neck. You're not even going to get the whole animal. That's just not happening. So completeness is most of the vertebra present. The other issue is distortion. We see distortion everywhere. So you have to take that into account when you're doing sauropod neck research. And therefore, any claims we make about sauropod neck research should be considered a hypothesis at best, not law. So this was maybe a little bit more of a downer paper, but it was a paper that showed there are some important issues we have to consider. My specimen is by no means perfect. This is cervical 11. As you can see, it has some problems with both completeness, though it is generally complete, as well as it has its problems with distortion. I've been dealing with that. So as we leave behind the background, let's get into what we came for, the meat. BYU 18531 is a specimen of Apatosaurus that was discovered at the Mill Canyon Quarry in southeastern Utah near Moab. This is a big animal. It is by no means as massive as the Apatosaurus they have in Oklahoma at the San Museum. This animal, with a pelvic width from ilia to ilia of 2.06 meters and a femur length of 1.73 meters, is a big Apatosaurus. This animal is big, and we found a lot of it, right? We have cervical 2 through cervical 15. We have almost every dorsal, it looks like, except dorsal 10. We have about 26 or 27 caudals, as well as a right scapulocoracoid, left femur, left fibula, 19 of the 20 dorsal ribs, and an assortment of other bones. Oh, partial sacrum, that's a big one. Partial sacrum and assortment of other bones. And this animal wasn't alone at this site. If you attended SVP, I talked a little bit about some of the other animals we found at the site. We find some shed Allosaurus teeth. We have evidence of a mold of a crocodile dermal ossicle. And we also see signs of gastropods. So there are other animals that died near this individual / potentially scavenged on it. Now, C2 through C15 are preserved in varying degrees of completeness, and most of them have minimal distortion. So this animal is really well preserved. So what are the hypotheses I'm trying to test? Well, using both osteological and cartilaginous neutral position, right? Apatosaurus excelsus held its neck in a horizontal position. This is the stance I'm taking, and we're going to see what I find. We also have that the neck of Apatosaurus excelsus was most flexible with lateral flexion, then ventral flexion, and least with dorsal flexion based on lateral sweep feeding and other evidence we've seen. It'll be interesting to see what I find with that. So how do we do this? We started with bones, and we had them on a pallet, or we had them in our photo booth, and we had to use photogrammetry to create 3D models. All right, so we go through the photogrammetry process using Agisoft Metashape, and voila, we have an initial 3D model. It's beautiful. I love it. And we have some prototype printed 3D models that we started experimenting with for manipulation. I just remembered I brought those with me. So for those in the physical space, you all can check out cervical 7, cervical 8 scaled down. These are prototypes. We have to print new ones based on some of the issues, but please check it out. See how they fit. How do they work? How do they move? Now, next, what we were going to do, we decided to go with the program Autodesk Maya. It's an animation software where we can build rigs to put all these bones together and figure out, all right, in the rig, how is this animal moving its neck? And as you can see here, we're showing off cervical 7. Pretty cool. So we put together a prototype rig. Hey, that's pretty snazzy. Look at that. That's a gorgeous neck. And even does a little bit of twisting, like a crocodile. Interesting. However, we realized, well, there are some problems with these bones. There is some retrodeformation. There was some error with some of the gluing that happened. And so there were problems we needed to fix because not all the bones went together perfectly when we printed them out. So I had to go back. I had to create some retrodeformed models, which are being made and eventually printed so we can use them in a motion capture lab. We're going to take these 3D prints, stick some of those little dots you see for animation, and use these in a motion capture lab to figure out, all right, how much are these prints moving? And then can we replicate that back in Maya? And then we'll do the same thing once we build cartilage. That's an issue I'm still working on is, all right, how are we going to do cartilage? Are we going to print cartilaginous discs? Are we going to use maybe silicone or another method? Something I'm still figuring out. A lot to do, a lot to work with. But I'm in the process of retrodeforming those bones. Today I was working a little bit with 11 and I was working on 12 out of 13. Now, why do I stop at 13? C14 through D1 are still connected by matrix. So we have plans to try and put those through a CT scanner so we can then make models, retrodeform those models, and then figure out, all right, how is C14 through the first dorsal also adding to the picture and moving itself? But so this retrodeformation process, how am I doing it? I find an error. Oh no, this doesn't look right on this lamina. I then have to go into Maya. We have to separate the part that's a problem. Then we move it, and then I stitch it back up. And then after we've stitched it, we've started coloring the parts that we filled back in. So we know, all right, what did we stitch back? What did we not stitch back? Except for this photo, that's cervical 11, that's cervical 11, and that's cervical 11. This is C9, but it is the exact same process. So, intervertebral cartilage, what are we going to do when we get there? Well, I'm going to initially start with this idea back from Taylor in 2014, where he had an equation that basically it looks like a Apatosaurus, right? Its cartilage to bone ratio is cartilage makes up about 10% the length of the bony centrum. So I can take measurements in Maya from our cotile to our condyle, get a length, and then figure out, all right, how much is 10%? And then, like I said, I'm still working on how are we going to create that physical cartilaginous disc. So still a lot of problems for me to figure out. This is a methods talk, people, but it's been a journey in itself. It's been a journey in itself. So we figured out that. And like I said, CT scanning. We're still trying to figure out where we're going to CT scan and try to make this happen. That way we can get C14 through D1 into the mix. Now, what is the significance of this? Why should you care? Why should I care? Well, first off, this can help us with diet inference. If we know how much this animal is moving its neck, and we generally know how tall it is, we can know from the specimens we find in the Morrison Formation, which is the unit of rock that this animal comes from, all right, what is this animal likely eating versus what is it not eating? In this case, unless it knocks it over, I don't think this thing is feeding from the top of the redwoods we find in the Morrison. But maybe ferns and cycads are likely more on the menu. Now, what is the other important thing other than diet inference? Well, replicative methods. If we can use this for this animal, maybe we can use it for other sauropods in the Morrison and figure out a little bit of the pieces to an ecological mystery that we're still trying to determine. What is this mystery? I call it the Coeval Morrison Sauropod issue, or CMSI. No, it is not a new crime show for the Morrison. Yeah, we got a homicide in the Jurassic. No. The Coeval Morrison Sauropod issue is this idea that this is a saturated environment. Here in Utah, all right, I'm going to do this. I got this. We have the evidence for at least 5 to 7 large-bodied animals living together in the same environment at the same time, and that should not be possible. All right, we got Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, Barosaurus, Supersaurus, Haplocanthosaurus, Camarasaurus, and Brachiosaurus, not to mention other potential regional animals such as Catydocus, Gallimimus, and potentially others we haven't even found. I mean, we have Morrison dicraeosaurids as well. So how are all these animals living in the same place at the same time? It doesn't make sense. I wrote a song about it. But if we can figure out how Apatosaurus is living in the environment, maybe then we can figure out how Brachiosaurus is living in the environment, how Camarasaurus is living in the environment, because I know we have some good necks for Camarasaurus. And we can figure out how all these animals are living together. I mean, predators are part of the story, but they can only do so much. And for all those John Wick fans out there, you know, I had to make this reference, so stay with me. The buddies the Morrison buried that day laid the foundation for sauropod paleontologists now. So my father loves John Wick, so it's a good quote. It's a good quote. Now, as we come to the end, I did want to make a quick side note I'd say similar to Thomas Holt's fashion. Morrison sauropods are great, and Diplodocids are great, but there also are a lot of other sauropodomorphs in general that also need some work with their necks. A lot of the animals discussed in these papers, other than Epistoselicadia, were Brachiosaurus and then mostly Diplodocus and Dicraeosaurids. So we still don't really know how exactly titanosaurs are moving their necks. We don't really know how pteriosaurs are moving their necks. We don't really know how a lot of early sauropodomorphs are moving their necks. Now, I didn't read every paper on the face of the planet, so I could be wrong. But I generally, when I looked, did not see anything for titanosaurs. And yes, most titanosaurs don't have beautiful whole necks, but there are a couple, I'm pretty sure, which we could start to get an idea for. So we got to get those other sauropod neck researchers out there. And we also obviously need to just get out there and dig more so we can find more specimens and add to the story. Because if we can figure out how these different groups all together, how is neck posture evolving and changing between the groups and across the whole family? Well, that's a beautiful story in itself. Now, at this point here, I've got my works cited, and questions.